Okay, everyone, let's make a start. Thank you very much for joining us on this fine Wednesday afternoon. I'm very, very pleased to be able to welcome Professor Andrea Genovese to this talk. I don't know how I pronounced that correctly, but I hope I was clear, close enough, Andrea. I believe you originally come from the Naples area in Italy, but have been based at Sheffield University for a considerable time now. Andrea is a professor of logistics and supply chain management, but has been working on much broader issues than logistics and supply chain management. I believe I could describe you as a systems person, and that involves thinking big in terms of how systems such as circular economy work or perhaps not work. So everybody's been talking about the circular economy for some time. A lot of proponents for it, from the Chinese government over the EU Commission to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Lots of businesses have jumped onto that bandwagon. It's a very popular concept. Literally thousands of people publish articles on the circular economy in journals such as the Journal of Cleaner Production. You've really made a whole business model out of publishing in circular economy. So it's been incredibly successful. But I believe what you've done really well, Andrea, is to sit back and ask a few critical questions of whether this thing that we call circular economy can actually work. What is included, what is perhaps excluded in our current conceptualization of it and in the actual practice. So you've been at the forefront of that thinking, and I'd like to thank you for doing that really path-breaking work. You've done really well getting this into the right journals, and I look forward to hearing from you. I believe you're sort of presenting a bit of a conglomeration of recent thought on this. So thank you again for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for the invitation and for the nice introduction. It's really an honor for me being here today. Yeah, you're right. I mean, this is a little bit of a conglomeration of my recent work. I'm also thanking you because this webinar has given me the opportunity to reflect about my personal journey through this research topic. So forgive me if this perspective might be incomplete, but it is something that I've started doing just, being stimulated by this invitation. And thanks again, Stefan, for suggesting also a nicer title to the seminar, The Past, Present and Future of Circular Economy, which I think describes nicely what I'm trying to cover today. So this is a brief agenda. So the circular economy, well, to define it in a dialectical way, we need to define first what it is a linear economy. And then, of course, we can talk through the fundamental characteristics of circular economy, trying to understand, however, that circular economy, besides being a bandwagon on which many people are jumping, journals are creating entire business models, is a battlefield, really. I mean, we have different versions of the circular economy concept, which are confronting among themselves. We might have alternative circular economy futures based on different principles. And then I'll try also, based on some recent papers of mine, to disentangle a little bit what are some implications which have been really overlooked in the circular economy debate, such as the conceptualization of value in a circular economy. What is value in a circular economy? So dialectically, before talking about a circular economy, what is a linear economy? What is the model we want to overcome in a transition towards a circular economy? Well, we can say it's the traditional post-industrial revolution economy, where we combine means of production which need to be reproduced when they become obsolete, labor, which also needs to be reproduced in the sense that workers need to be housed, fed, trained, kept healthy. Natural resources, which are another input to production processes, which, of course, for a long time have been seen as free. And this vision of a linear economy, when one of the main objectives is economic growth, and in order to achieve economic growth, we need to boost consumption, and so boost also the utilization of non-renewable natural resources, well, has been at the foundation of economic thought in the 20th century. Here we see two quotations from two key economic thinkers from the 20th century. Keynes and Victor Label was the father of consumerism in the United States, stating that we need to do whatever is possible to boost consumption. And even Victor Label saying we need things consumed, burned up, replaced, and discarded at an ever-accelerating rate. Of course, I mean, you know, this, even for the 20th century, was not a novelty. Karl Marx in the 19th century had described the money, commodity, money first cycle, saying that capitalism requires the quick disappearance of commodities from the sphere of circulation and their equally quick replacement by fresh commodities. And of course, this velocity of circulation of commodities influences capital circulation. So really, capitalism, the economic system that we have based our societies upon in the last centuries, is based on this idea of replacing commodities in a quicker and quicker way. And of course, I mean, this generates waste. This can generate the emergence of a metabolic rift in the interaction between mankind, humanity, and the rest of nature. And of course, I mean, this mechanism is also exacerbated by another general law that Marx described in the 19th century, so-called tendency of the rate of profit to fall. To fight this tendency, firms, organizations need to implement several strategies, such as delocalizing production to fight against workers' demands, introducing artificial innovation, planned obsolescence, if we want to give a sort of contemporary interpretation of this general trend, which of course increase even further this trend of capitalism to produce waste. And when we say waste, we are not just talking about physical waste. Of course, physical waste is a visible byproduct of capitalism, and it has created crises even in the global north. But think about also the poor allocation of resources that our economic systems sometimes produce for pursuing some economic objectives we have been talking about. Well, think about the automotive industry, for instance. Think about the car as the main product of this industry, think about it as a symbol of the 20th century capitalism, well, cars remain parts 92% of the time. So we produce things that we cannot really say are useful. And even when they move, they usually carry 1.5 people at a time, well below the capacity. So when we talk about waste, we're also talking about waste of capacity. Think about the building and construction industry. Well, that produced 30% of the waste sent to landfill in Europe every year. But at the same time, this huge amount of resources, this huge amount of waste is produced for building office blocks, which even in the pre-COVID era were occupied just for 40–50% of a day on a working day. We have 11 million empty homes in Europe. So you can see that this need to grow generates waste, physical waste, but also underutilization of assets. And the same can be retrieved, the similar figures in terms of poor allocation, pure utilization of resources can be retrieved also in other industries such as the food industry, where every year in Europe, for instance, we have 100 million tons of food lost. And 50% of these losses happen along the production chain with little ability to recycle this waste. So we can say that the circular economy is a response to this tendency of our economic systems to create waste through a series of feedback loops which aim to reduce production and basically to produce what's needed, to reuse products if they can be utilized, if we can extend their useful life, to refurbish them, and then just as last resort to recycle them. Well, we try through this framework, at least in theory, to address this tendency of our economic systems to produce waste and to require an ever-growing amount of resources. And one of the things that I realized when I started looking at circular economy, mainly from a supply chain perspective, which is my main specialism, is that in the initial theorization of a circular economy, these three imperatives, reduce, reuse, recycle, well, they had also some transformative potential, especially the first imperative, reduce. Well, one could interpret this also as focus on socially useful production, focus on products which serve a purpose, stop innovating just for the sake of having people changing their mobile phone every 2 years and throwing away products which are perfectly usable. What we have observed in recent years, I would say in the last decade, when this idea was championed by several think tanks, by consultancy organizations, even by some national governments, is that these three imperatives have become many more. Now we don't have just reduce, reuse, recycle. Somebody talks about even the 10 R's, but really what we see is that, okay, we have refurbish, remanufacture, repurpose, rethink, but probably the key one, reduce, focus on performance rather than on physical assets, focus on service rather than on products, well, probably this imperative has lost a little bit of traction and of importance. And we checked these by looking at corporate literature. In a recent article of ours, basically we scanned corporate sustainability report for Fortune 500 companies. Basically, we realized that for these organizations, circular economy practices are a must to be mentioned within their sustainability reports. But typically, of course, they engage with actions which reflect a very reductionist interpretation of the circular economy concepts. They engage with recycling, with energy efficiency, but of course, they stay quite away from some disruptive business models which would require them to rethink their operations. So despite starting to implement some C practices where there is a form of linear lock-in, we define this phenomenon in this way, such as, they tend to focus on the lowest R imperatives, staying away from those measures which could cannibalize future sales. For instance, manufacturers in the electronic electric equipment industry, are quite worried about manufacturing easy to repair products, as this might cannibalize future sales. Now, of course, there is growing legislation in this area, but the rate of uptake seems quite slow. Also, other phenomena like this one can be retrieved in governmental regulation and political parties' manifestos. This is an extract from the 2018 government agreement between two Italian political parties, the Five Star Movement, which is a populist party, and the Northern League, which is a right-wing party. Basically, in this manifesto that they subscribed before forming an agreement, in this coalition agreement, they had a chapter about circular economy. But again, circular economy just seen as waste management. So this transformational content that the circular economy idea, challenging some of the fundamental mechanisms that we have in a capitalist economic system, are slowly going away. And so in a recent paper that I wrote with my friend Mario Pansera, we essentially postulated that the circular economy discourse conveyed by the EU and by large multinational enterprises really avoids some fundamental questions, which to us are the questions to be asked. First of all, who decides what to produce, why to produce, and how to produce? How does this shift to a circular economy need to happen? Do we need to continue to produce the same products just in a circular, more efficient manner? And is this efficiency enough for a transition towards a circular economy? And then what are the social implications of such shifts? I mean, this is something that is quite often neglected. I mean, who wins, who loses? What happens to those sectors which might be suffering as a result of the transition towards a circular economy? What happens in terms of jobs which might be lost? And also, another fundamental contradiction that we see is that the implementation of a circular economy in EU policy documents, but also in materials produced by think tanks, foundations, does not challenge the growth-oriented framework of our economy. And this is not surprising, I would say. This is not surprising because if you look at the European treaties, such as the Maastricht Treaty, which is now suspended. If you look at the European Stability Mechanism, which is now relaxed, but of course in a few months might come back in operation, well, the key parameters on which the economic performance of countries is evaluated include GDP as a measure. Think about the public debt to GDP ratio. Think about the government deficit to GDP ratio. If we implement measures which could cause a shrinkage of GDP because we are producing less but better, and this could cause us problems within the current framework, at least of European economies, which need to observe these parameters. Otherwise, you might be in trouble. And so it seems that this framework still relies on the possibility of the decoupling between environmental impacts and economic growth, of which even, think tanks like the European Environment Agency have become critical. Here you have got a couple of recent papers, position papers, which were published on the website of the European Environment Agency, which suggest that probably decoupling is not something we can achieve easily. So what seems to us is that this circular economy idea, which potentially includes some transformational potential, has been turned into a sort of eco-modernist idea in which technology and the market will take care of it. There is no political transformation required for implementing a greener economy. There is no need for planning. We can achieve win-win solutions easily, and no worries, economic growth can still be our fundamental preoccupation. Of course, I mean, there could be alternative framings of a circular economy, and essentially in the work we did with Mario, we tried to link the idea of a circular economy to the idea of conviviality, the idea of a society where production needs are based on real social needs, on the respect between on the respect of the metabolism between humanity and nature. So conviviality as opposed to efficiency, productivity. Of course, this requires a radical rethinking also of labor and of the hierarchical organization of production. It also invests supply chain planning quite in a radical manner, in the sense that, well, these days, production is not organized in factories anymore, but in supply chains. So is it realistic to think about supply networks of liberated factories, so factories that produce in a convivial way? Well, this is the work that we are trying to do at the moment, focusing on few case studies, on a few practical examples. And I want to show quickly some of these to you. For instance, we think that bottom-up convivial circular economy could be a way to deal with industrial crisis. In Europe, we have every year factories which close down because production is not anymore convenient. Production is shifted in other countries. This is the story of a plant in my hometown, Naples, a Whirlpool plant, so basically owned by an American multinational enterprise. They produce the washing machines. Of course, since the company operates within the European Union, they decided to shift production to a more convenient production site. Of course, there was a big struggle from the workers, which were demanding some public intervention, were demanding the nationalization of the factory. Now, What struck me at the time was that workers were demanding the nationalization of the factory to produce exactly the same appliances. And of course, if you're operating within an open market economy within the EU, well, producing these goods there is not competitive. So even a nationalized factory would have had a very short lifespan, probably. Our idea was, why don't we convert this factory using the know-how of the workers, using the local know-how in partnership with the local universities, in partnership with the local vocational school, into a national center for repairing, refurbishing, remanufacturing appliances inspired by a circular economy paradigm. Unfortunately, they didn't listen to us, but this principle of using circular economy as a way to address industrial crisis is being used at the moment in a couple of similar situations with more success. So there is hope. And another example, this one a successful one, again from Italy. Sorry if I draw on the Italian context for examples, but I know it very well, and you know, it's a country full of contradictions, which provides a lot of nice examples. After COVID, all Italian schools, to comply with the physical distancing regulations, needed to get rid, essentially, of their two-seater desks, where two students were sitting in the same desk, to buy these one-seater wheeled desks. Of course, this cost the government a lot of money. Then these desks didn't arrive on time for the start of the academic year. And this created a lot of outrage in the public opinion. Well, what a vocational school in Naples did to deal with this problem was using the local lab in the school, using the students, involving the students in the process and their teachers, plus some local artisans. They cut themselves, the original desks, into two in such a way that they could utilize them in the class without sending to landfill perfectly usable desks, saving money to the school, saving resources from being produced. So this school didn't order the new desks, saving money. Actually, again, an example of how circular economy solutions can come from the bottom up. Another example, a great scandal, we have had it pretty much in every country. At the start of the pandemic, there was a shortage of personal protection equipment, especially masks. Many governments signed very expensive contracts to source these masks from overseas. And in most of the cases, also the quality of the products they got was not very good. I mean, many of these masks were unusable. What an Italian region did, the Puglia region of Italy, Bari's region, well, they had a factory which was an abandoned textile factory, which the regional government had acquired because essentially it had gone bankrupt. They converted it into a mask factory. So essentially using existing production capacity, using existing land to serve local needs, to serve local social needs. Another example from a paper which I published a few years ago, instead of using insulation materials which come from the mining industry, insulation materials for our buildings, well, let's recycle end-of-life textile materials such as denim textile. There is this company, Le Relais in France, which collects blue jeans that people donate, for converting them in these briquettes of insulation materials, which have exactly the same performance as rock wool or other types of thermal insulation. So you can see that actually we have a plurality of circular futures. Circular economy doesn't have to be the eco-modernist circular economy. There could be alternatives. And what we then started to reflect upon is that, well, these alternative circular futures could be seen as value articulating institutions that implicitly adhere to a conception of value, even if this is not explicitly acknowledged. When we were working on these case studies, I started thinking, and I said, wait a minute, here we are conceptualizing an economy in which value is theorized in a fundamentally different way. And so what we did was essentially reviewing theories of value from the history of economic thought. Essentially, we classified them in receivers theories of value and donor theories of value. And basically what we tried to do was characterizing different circular economy futures we could have, such as the circular modernist scenario that I have described, the bottom-up scenario, which I have just described, but also other scenarios which were introduced by Thomas Bowens from the University of Utrecht in a recent paper of his, such as a circularity by command, a sort of Soviet Union planned economy circularity, and a peer-to-peer circularity, where essentially the shift towards a circular economy is run by platform capitalism companies such as Amazon or Airbnb, Deliveroo, and essentially trying to understand what would be the economic foundation of each of these scenarios. And we felt that this was something that needed to be done, because surprisingly, the circular economy literature doesn't have any roots in economic thinking. So we said, okay, we'll imagine these hypothetical sustainable futures, but what are the economic foundations of each of these futures? And so, of course, while, you know, it's very easy to understand that the circular modernist scenario is fully compatible with a sort of free market economy, and so we could use neoclassical price theory within this scenario, well, we started questioning ourselves about value conceptualization in the other scenarios. And so we understood, for instance, that in order to conceptualize the planned circularity scenario, where you have the invisible hand supplanted by central planning and coordination, probably value in this context cannot be determined through a neoclassical theory of value. Value in this context is probably more linked to a cost of production theory, or to theories based on physical calculations like energy theories of value. The value of products is determined essentially by its embodied energy. In the case of a bottom-up scenario, like the one I described in more detail, we are dealing with localized production and a significant reduction in consumption. And probably this is better conceptualized in terms of value through the deliberative approaches that you can find in the literature, or through Herman Daly steady state economics, where you have a combination of participatory planning and markets. And then, of course, we have this peer-to-peer circularity scenario, where the transition to a circular economy happens through servitization platforms, which is an hybrid scenario where you could have either community-owned platforms. In that case, a deliberative approach to value would be more compatible, but also this could be characterized by a neoclassical scenario where essentially you have platform capitalism through the likes of Uber, Amazon, and Airbnb. So we devised this radar diagram to investigate the compatibility of each of these scenarios with each of the theories of value. And this could be, according to us, a very promising line of work, trying to refine, sorry, fire alarm. It's just a test. And yeah, a very interesting line of future work, looking at how to refine the conceptualization of value in circular futures. And this focus on a modernist approach to circular economy and on a neoclassical conceptualization of value is very much apparent in the supply chain management literature, my literature. Supply chains are acknowledged by circular economy scholars as a building block for the transition towards a circular economy. However, if you look at the supply chain management literature, this literature is very much focused on low R imperatives. The reduce and refuse imperatives are completely overlooked. There is this perennial growth assumption in the supply chain management literature, which basically, to me, is a big shortcoming. We are not doing the right type of work that is required to support the transition. And so that's why what we are focusing at the moment is a reconceptualization of supply chains to support the transition towards a more ambitious circular economy, which probably will build on the extension of post-growth, A-growth paradigms into the supply chain management domain. So just to conclude this personal perspective, we can say that certainly circular economy has become a popular buzzword. It means many different things to many different stakeholders. And I recognize that it's almost an empty signifier. But I still think that the circular economy mobilizes some powerful concepts. It's something that is immediately understandable by the wider public. And why this is the case? Well, because waste is a visible byproduct of capitalism, and it is something that has generated visible crises, even in the global north. I mean, think about what I was mentioning, the Naples region in Italy, where we had a major waste crisis in 2004 till 2010. And so my take on circular economy, there is this debate even among ourselves. Shall we drop it? Shall we, just get off the bandwagon? It's becoming too crowded. I think the challenge is to repoliticize it and to create alternative narratives which can challenge the mainstream one, and bringing then also the need to support this ambitious transition within our own disciplines, in my case, supply chain management. Thank you very much. I tried to stay within the allocated time. These are a few projects that we are coordinating, whose websites you can visit, and you can be updated about our latest research. Thank you, and I look forward to questions and interactions with you.
Great, thank you very much, Andrea. That was great. Thank you. We've got a lot of people who've put questions into the chat. If you don't mind having a look at them as well, Andrea will sort of highlight some of them. We can't probably get involved with all of them, but well, let's try. There were one or two questions around the relationship between circular economy and degrowth. That question was originally posted before you started talking about post-growth. Could you just sort of expand on that a little bit? So are you essentially, I mean, there's a whole literature emerging, and not just literature, but you know, a kind of a grassroots movement around degrowth emerging. So is your argument as such essentially that circular economy needs to be merged with a degrowth agenda?
Hey, thank you, Stefan. And I was expecting this question because it's something that comes up every time. My answer is that I don't know, in the sense that, you know, degrowth to me is problematic because it evokes quite negative imaginaries. When you mention the word degrowth, people start thinking about recession, people start thinking about scarcity, people start thinking about going back in time. And while I recognize that some of the arguments provided by degrowth theory are really good and, you know, are really important in order to comprehend the biophysical limits within which we work. For instance, I'm a big admirer of Giorgos Kallis' work, his book, you know, Limits, which is a short pamphlet. It's really a convincing and compelling argument for understanding culture of limits. I think it would be better to talk about a growth in the sense that we need to redefine growth. I'm not against growth per se. I think, you know, that measuring growth in a quantitative way, it doesn't really tell us much. If we focus on alternative indicators, which are well-being indicators, or, you know, unemployment rate, literacy rates, life expectancy, probably, you know, these are the true things on which we should focus. Then, whether this is obtained through a growing GDP or through degrowing GDP, to me, it doesn't really matter. The important things are the biophysical limits within which we need to operate, the fact that we need to expand the decision-making when it comes to economic decisions, and then whatever framework we want to use, it's fine to me. Of course, I mean, you know, from the degrowth movement, the importance of the biophysical limits is something we can definitely take. I would just be critical about, you know, the using the word degrowth, which can be, you know, something that is problematic sometimes. But yeah, I'm not against the kind of imaginary that suggests, and this idea of a convivial bottom-up circular economy has clearly got many links to that sort of grassroots movement you were talking about. I hope I responded.
Yeah, yes and no. I think, Andrea, I think it's a difficult one to tackle, but let's move on because we've got quite a few more questions here in the chat. So thank you everyone for putting your sometimes quite long questions or comments in the chat. There's a question on, so you emphasized in your talk some alternatives. You emphasized the importance of local bottom-up alternatives. So there's a question on how transformational can this really be? And is this not actually part of the imaginary of circular modernism, precisely you know, what is really the difference, as it were?
Well, I mean, the difference, first of all, is in the kind of deliberation that would need to happen in the level of democratic control that you have over the organization of production. If you go back to the paper that Thomas Bowens and his co-authors introduced, where they characterize, you know, this circular modernism approach, well, this is really, you know, characterized by very centralized level of decision making, and we can see this as sort of scenario in which we are at the moment, where you have mainly top-down initiatives, priorities which are set at a central level, with little or no input from the local community. If you think also about, you know, these national recovery plans which were put together in a post-COVID scenario, both inputs have local communities had on the way, you know, this money needs to be spent. Again, talking about Italy, which is the context which I know a little bit more. There is a chapter about circular economy in a national recovery plan. It's mainly about recycling plants. It's not about the transformation of supply chains. It's not empowering local productions. And again, there has not been an input into this. So at a theoretical level, the way in which these two scenarios differ is, first of all, this one, at the level of reliance on centralized versus decentralized decision-making, and also the other axis that you can see in the classification is the fate, if you want, in technology, which is a fundamental characteristic of modernist approaches. Technology will save us. We will become more efficient. There will be nuclear energy we can rely upon, so we don't need to worry that much. On the other hand, let's focus on what we have at the moment. Let's focus on repairing things. Let's focus on making products more durable. So they are two entirely opposite scenarios on the framework that Thomas presented. And of course, I mean, we are trying also to elaborate on that framework to understand also what other dimensions could be brought into the equation in order to characterize even more distinct circular futures.
Okay, Andrea, we need to move on. We're moving to the value part of your talk. So there's a comment and question that a lot of the value theories you presented are really based on economic value, not so much on social or public value. And there are other forms of value that we could add here. So the question is, are there other circular futures emerging if we have a much broader perspective of value, not just economic value?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, this was just the first attempt in order to try to couple a bit circular economy elaborations with the economic literature. It all started, you know, because we went to Google Scholar, we ran a simple search, circular economy, theory of value, and nothing came up. So we tried to understand how theories of value, also coming from very heterodox economics, can be brought into the equation again. And yet, I agree on the fact that social values are not captured in the dominant theories of value. However, if you look at deliberative approaches, for instance, which we cited in that framework, well, you have there the possibility of incorporating social considerations into your value judgments, value assessments. If you use participatory methods, that can be done as well. So clearly there is scope for more work there, but there are already some approaches which could be matched to some more ambitious circular futures.
Thank you, Andrea. There's a question on conviviality, which is a great concept, Irma says, but also a little bit difficult to define what exactly is convivial and what is not.
Yeah, for that I suggest, reading a little book from Ivan Illich, which is called Tools for Conviviality. It's about designing products, technologies, which can be context related, which can have a positive interaction with the local environment, with local communities, and technologies which won't have a detrimental impact in the long run. And in this book, which is just 100 pages long, so written in a very colloquial way, Ivan Illich also provides several examples of what can be classed as a convivial technology. And in the paper we wrote with Mario, we also introduce a list of dimensions we could use to determine what a convivial technology is.
Right. I'm going through the many comments and questions.
Yeah, I see the paper from Callisto Friant, and it is something we have read recently, on which we are also basing some further analysis about circular futures we are devising at the moment. And yeah, definitely I agree about the comment being agnostic about economic growth. As Kate Rayward said, yeah, absolutely, I share very much that position. In the end, we might even stop measuring GDP. Measuring GDP is a very costly activity. Think about all the economic modeling that goes into that. Wouldn't it be better devoting those resources to something else? I'm just being provocative, but maybe not. But yeah, I agree with that position myself.
There's a question here that goes something like this. Is circular economy essentially related to green capital accumulation? Or let me rephrase it. Is green capitalism and circular economy essentially the same thing from your perspective, at least the way it is practiced and propagated by most actors?
Yeah, it could be, absolutely. I mean, what we have defined as circular modernism is a way to further valorize byproducts, waste, and to include, if you want, waste once again in the capital accumulation dynamic. So absolutely, I would agree with that definition 100%. It's also interesting, that as I was saying, if you go to the corporate sustainability reports of the most prominent Fortune 500 companies, all of them have a section related to circular economy. There is definitely a lot that can be done in terms of business opportunities related to this interpretation of circular economy. And the problem is that given the biophysical constraints within which we operate, given the thermodynamics law in which we operate, fortunately or unfortunately, this is probably not going to solve the challenges we are facing at the moment. But I would 100% agree with this definition, definitely.
Great. My colleague Stefano has his hand up, who's a fellow Nepalese. So maybe you talk to each other in Italian, or maybe not.
Well, we may turn now to talk Neapolitan, which is a language in itself. Ciao Andrea, welcome, and it's very nice to see you. It's just a reflection to use this opportunity. And it's about the theories that you have mobilized in your work, and deals with something I've tried at the beginning of my career when I started to be interested in circular economy. And I've been trained as an applied economist, not a theorist. I do know some economists around the globe. I've tried to kind of convince them that, you know, circular economy could be a place where, you know, you could do good theory also as an economist. And that has been the most frustrating exercise probably of my entire academic career, without mentioning the toxicity of some of the conversations of the type circular economy doesn't exist. What you're talking about is simply an impartially defined model. As soon as you start considering waste as an asset, in the long run, everything is going to be to recirculating, that kind of reasoning that you just mentioned. So I get to the point. Why do you think, disciplinarily speaking, you know, economists, particularly theorists, have turned so uninterested on this? What is your take?
That's a good question, Stefano. And yeah, it's something that I've kept asking myself. And at a given point, I decided to stop asking this question to myself and trying to solve the problem, in the sense that we have launched a new project, which is Just to See, which we mentioned in the final slide, where essentially, you know, we have included some macroeconomists who deal with economics modeling to start thinking about macroeconomic models to deal with the circular economy. And we have also run a literature review on the topic, and there is something that is starting to pick up. There are also some promising models that can be used in order to deal with a circular economy representation at a macroeconomic level. For instance, I don't know if you're aware about stock flow consistent models, which are very much utilized in the post-Keynesian economics community. There are already some of these models which have been environmentally and ecologically extended. Input-output models, the ones originating from Leontief conceptualization, can be used to a very good extent to essentially represent circular economy and the transition towards a circular economy by their definition, because you have this very nice concept of the technical coefficient matrix, where essentially, you know, you can also model different policies, different technological transitions. So I'm a bit optimistic now than I was a few years ago, in the sense that I see finally something moving. And we badly need this because, as Stefan was saying at the beginning, circular economy research has been dominated so far by JCP type papers focusing on technical solutions, on micro case studies, but in order, you know, to investigate further the feasibility of this solution at a societal level, we need the involvement of economists. And there are also economists who have already done quite nice type of work on the topic. I think about, you know, Simone D'Alessandro from Pisa, who recently published a very nice paper on Nature Communications about an environmentally extended stock flow consistent model. So something is moving. I think, you know, there was a misunderstanding at the beginning from the economists. As you say, I mean, you know, they were misinterpreting the meaning of circular economy, not understanding that it is about technical solutions, paradigm shift that needs to be tested then from an economic point of view. That's where their contribution can come. But yeah, I agree with you. I share your frustration. It has taken me years to establish a productive dialogue with them.
Okay, we probably need to come to an end. People have got other things to do, but thanks very much for staying on. Maybe a last question is to do with sort of human behavior. We've had a few questions around that. One comment or question was, you know, people don't just want to reuse, they want to buy new stuff, and particularly if you're based in the global south, there's a kind of a there's a sort of a, you know, inner human drive to you know, to get new stuff, the stuff that you don't have. So there's a sort of psychology there. And then another question around, you know, essentially, I mean, you know, you're probably not a psychologist, but do you see research emerging that links circular economy to more, you know, deeper transformational, here in the question it is talked about socio-technical systems changes that include the human, as it were. So it's about, you know, it's more than just technological system transformation, but you know, wider systems transformation that includes the inner self of the human and our behavior and our desires and our drive. So there's something quite transformational needed also in our bodies, in our minds, in our way of being and desiring, etc.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with that as well. Even though I think, you know, if I want to be loyal to my personal convictions here, that these personal desires, these personal expectations, behaviors are always a result of the economic structure, of what somebody would call the economic structure. So I agree that, you know, these behaviors, these sort of beliefs, habits are something that are part of the problem. And of course, you know, there is emerging research on these issues. We have, for instance, within our Retrace network, which is this doctoral network at an European level, of which also Stefan is part, one of our early stage researchers is running behavioral experiments looking at consumption. And so, yeah, I understand that in the current economic system, there is the behavioral element, which is quite strong. However, I think, you know, to me, the structural dimension is really the prevailing one. Of course, you know, given that we are not going to change, unfortunately, the economic structure anytime soon, probably, you know, also work at the behavioral individual level is useful. So we need to strike a balance, absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrea. I should say here that this talk has been part of the Research Away Day of the Department of Sustainable Futures, which is part of the University of Exeter, based in Cornwall in the far southwest of England. So so we will go away into an actual room now and have a cup of tea or coffee and talk more about what you presented and the discussion. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you specifically to you, Andrea. It was very very insightful and inspirational to think in these wider systems terms. So we will go away and do some more thinking and talking. Thanks for joining, everyone, and have a good afternoon and enjoy the rest of your study leave, Andrea.
Just wanted to say, yeah, I'm sorry we weren't able to respond to all the questions. However, yeah, just feel free to email me. I'll type my email in the chat, and happy to have further conversations and to respond to any question you might have. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.